Hi Dash. Over the past
Hi, Rishi.
over the past many years, I've been trying to make sense of this world a little bit. The real, the physical, the metaphysical, and all the other realms of it, right? Um, and I do this by asking questions and by running experiments and by building and by writing books. Something that I have been extremely curious about more recently is the word empathy, and how the true embodiment of it could actually look like. The first time I came across the word empathy was many years ago when I was a part of a workshop, and we were using empathy as a concept, as a tool to understand the users we were trying to build for. And as it happens, I thought, when you come across a new word in the dictionary, it starts showing up everywhere. And that's what was happening with empathy, that it was in fact showing up everywhere. But when I looked at it objectively, I realized that empathy has in fact become a buzzword. Now, Dash, you as a coach work with individuals and you observe society. Why do you think empathy is such a buzzword today?
Yeah, I have, thanks, Rishi. I have myself been intrigued by that word for a while now, and I started studying it with a lot of sort of focused intent. And I discovered something really interesting is the word is a kind of a very new word in the scheme of things. It not so coincidentally was born around the time mass production and industrialization was born. The word came into being in 1910, 1910, and it's sort of grown in importance as the industrial era has grown. So it sort of mimics what I would call a sort of a dehumanization of society with the industrialization. As we've industrialized ourselves, in some ways we've been sort of searching for our own abstract answers to purpose, meaning, empathy. These words have shown up, and there's been a drumbeat lately around these words, and empathy seems to be part of that journey that humanity has taken to sort of find the human self in this largely dehumanized world. In some ways, if you look at schools, workplaces, if you look at society at large, countries measured only by GDP, we have really seen sort of a machinification of us. And in contrast to that, then we start searching for us in this what is human, if in the contrast to machine. Design and innovation, on the other hand, you use the word workshop, is also sort of latched on to that, saying how do I now find deeper aspects to differentiate with. So it was great to differentiate with form and function, but now I have to understand emotions of people. So in some ways, a lot of people have come towards this word from different angles, but the essential idea, I feel, is between this idea of, while there's outer order, there seems to be an inner disorder. As the outer gets more ordered, the inner gets more disordered. And in that, we try and sort of search for this, who am I? And, in that sense, the ship of Theseus paradox, Rishi, where we say, if all the parts of the ship are replaced, is it the same ship or it's a different ship? And in some ways, empathy is that. So who are you and who am I as humans? I think that's what the word trying to ask in its word.
It's interesting you use the word dehumanization, and the way it shows up in our society, because I always thought that dehumanization in our lives would show up only at the extreme closures, loss of a loved one, a breakup, loss of a job. But it seems that it is more evident than it has ever been before, the way it shows up in our lives. Now, before we speak about humanization and what it means to be human, I would love to understand, going back to the word empathy, what does it truly mean? Because it is used interchangeably with compassion, it is used interchangeably with sympathy, sometimes even kindness. So, what does it mean? What does empathy truly mean, and how is it different from the rest of the words we use to describe it?
And that's a great point to bring up, saying because we interchangeably use these words: empathy, sympathy, compassion, kindness. And I thought there is no great objective answer to this. I have thought about it a bit, and I realized this is sort of a spectrum that I will try and table here. This is my own definition, not anybody else's. So empathy kind of latches itself to this idea of participation. I want to be in your shoes. I want to be in your life. It is the idea of immersing yourself in the world. Now that's about being, and I have an issue with it. I'll talk about it later, but about moving into someone's world and looking at the world through that. That's empathy in participation. Sympathy, on the other hand, has a bit of distance, which is saying, I observe you and I sympathize with where you are. I sympathize with what's happening to you. I sympathize with where you are in this journey. So that's sympathy. And I observe and I acknowledge. Compassion, on the other hand, actually says, I don't know who you are. I don't really know who you are because I don't have the capacity to know you, but I still care unconditionally for you. Not knowing you, I would still care, and it doesn't matter who you are. So empathy, by the way, the underlying code, as you would observe, is suffering for all of these, that they all acknowledge that the human condition is that of suffering, which is what the Buddhists talk about. And in that, this empathy says, I want to be you and understand life. Sympathy says, I want to observe you and acknowledge. Compassion says, I don't know who you are, and I yet want to be there for you and care for you. But my problem with this word empathy is that, can you ever be in someone's shoes? That's the question I ask myself and I ask others. Can we ever be in anybody else's shoes and be true to that purpose? I mean, that's a thought.
No, absolutely. And just to build on that thought, right? Through some work on self and through a lot of reading, through a lot of experimentation, what has become clear to me is that most of what I look at the world is a projection of where I am and where I come from and how I'm feeling in this moment. So then how do you sort of take a step back from it and learn how to walk in someone's shoes? Like, is that even possible? Is it even possible to truly empathize then?
And that is the paradoxical center point of empathy. That is a paradoxical axiom sort of thing. For you to empathize, you have to be in someone's shoes. Now, my question is, and before we try and address that, Rishi, so to understand certain words, we have to understand what is the opposite of that word. So if I ask you this question, what is the opposite of empathy? Can you answer that question? That's right. So if most people frame it as that, now that's not a wrong answer, but I feel a better answer, in my opinion, is the opposite of empathy is judgment. Now think about it for a minute. What I bring to the table is, the moment I see something, any object, any idea, my instinctive response is that of judgment. And where does judgment come from? It comes from my conditioning. Now, for me to truly empathize it, you have to relinquish judgment. And so, because judgment and empathy almost come from the same space. So they're two sides of the same coin, as pain and pleasure. So to be able to absolutely empathize, I have to be absolutely free of judgment. And is it truly possible for any human being to observe a phenomena or an individual or an idea without any judgment, which means almost being thoughtless in that sense? Now, I wonder, maybe it's one of the superpowers, but I wonder, can we ever relinquish judgment and hence truly be empathetic?
That brings me to my next question, Dash. Now, as a coach, you have to create a safe space with the people that you work with, and you must really get to know them, to work with them, to empower them, to enable them, to support them. Empathy seems difficult. It really seems difficult to practice and to embody so far. But as a coach, you do that day in and day out. What are some of the methods and frameworks that you use to really get to know someone?
Yeah, I spent my entire time observing human behavior at scale and at depth. I mean, that's what I do for a living as a coach and as a pattern mapper. And I've always, I wouldn't say that I've mastered it, but I've worked on it consciously. Being consciously working on it allows you to sort of improve upon this practice of empathy. And the first principle of that is to not form a judgment, and hence to not have any opinion walking into any situation. And so there are three directions that I look for. When I'm trying to unlock the story of a human or a story of society, I try and look for where does the human story appear. Actually, it's a product of three forces, and each is a very powerful force in itself. So let me try and explain. At the center point is knowing the story of someone, which is an act of empathy. The first force is that of biology. Now, we are all bodies of biochemistry playing out. So if you are a teenager, if your hormones will tell you, will behave. That's not your personality. That's your hormones shaping your personality at that point. Same with menopause. Same with other life stages. So that's biochemistry. And then there is evolutionary biology. In the face of danger, human response is a particular kind. In the face of care, love, safety, evolutionary biology plays a very strong role in how we shape our thinking and behavior. And so because we are still 98.7% chimps in our gene code, so we can't relinquish the fact that it's the nature of nature that is playing through us. And there is so little free will that we have. So to understand someone, we have to understand which of this is coming from biology. That's force one. Force two is psychology. A lot of who we are as a personality gets shaped in our childhood between the age of 0 to 7 and then between the teenage years. And so to really understand someone, you have to understand psychologically what they bring to the table. The same trigger could derive different responses from different individuals because of the psychological framework that they carry, which also forms a judgment. Psychology, if you have grown up with the story of abandonment, then you'll respond to situations differently. You have grown up with extreme indulgence, you will respond to same situation differently. So you see, your stories as a child actually impact how you see the world and hence how you judge the world. So that second theme is that of psychology, which is a very, very powerful force. The first one is the deepest, which is biology, psychology. And the last is a mediating force called culture. Now that's sort of kind of trying to balance you with society. Now, we call ourselves, Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, Americans, vegans. These are words, these are social constructs, these are culture codes that we embody, try and imbibe. So if you're living in Singapore, you will behave in a particular way, you'll try and behave in a particular way to adhere to norms. If you're working in Microsoft versus if you're working in Google, you're wrapped in a culture code. Now that changes behaviors and hence personality. So we now look at this. Your story is at the center of it, and these three forces are always playing out. So you are kind of at the intersection of these three forces, and the resultant of that is the story of us. So my job is to sort of, is as an analyst, is to start looking at where does it come from. And for that, you have to create a bit of distance and to sort of step back a bit and observe what's happening here. Look at data. Look at the why behind the data. Look at the why. Ask yourself the why behind it. Where does it come from? And not form a judgment. And to that extent, it's sort of strange that one has to be away from an individual to be truly empathetic in some ways, to be able to observe without any hypothesis.
At a time when there is so much distance between ourself, the true self, the idea of self, which is being then moved around with all of these forces around, I wonder, how does one know themselves first? Because how do I empathize and how do I practice empathy with others if I'm unable to practice empathy with self? So Dash, if I were to ask you this difficult question, how do I empathize with self? Where do I start?
That's such a great question, Rishi. So, in the airplane, they say when the mask falls, they put your mask first before you try and help the others. And that applies to empathy as well. I think first self-empathize before you empathize with the other. And I think self-empathy, we are in an era where, we have become statistically our biggest enemy. If you look at mental health as an idea, if you look at the number of people killing themselves, and depression is the single biggest disability, it is the number one disability today. All this comes from this crisis of self-empathy that, I am battling my own self. And I think it's very important that we bring this subject to table, saying, how do I empathize with myself? Care for myself first. And for that, you have to step away from your own thoughts. You have to tell yourself that I'm a product of my conditioning. And conditioning is what I've inherited. And so you have to separate your own consciousness from your thought and to be able to observe your conditioning. And to be able to analyze it without forming a judgment that I'm a sinner or I'm a saint or I'm a good or a bad guy. All of that. In fact, morality comes in the way of empathy because we form very strong judgments about morality and some of these religious concepts, force us to develop morality. And I actually sometimes push back against that, saying, let the person be true to themselves, observe themselves. So you observe yourself, gather data, and then understand who am I minus my conditioning, I mean, if I were to, and who am I as a product of my conditioning? Then you're able to see yourself as this person outside of you. To be able to observe yourself from a distance is, I think, the highest power that an individual could carry. That's probably called meditation. That is what probably is called to be able to observe your thought. You start with your breath, and they say, please observe your thought. And then I would say, please observe yourself in the silence of who you are. And probably you'll be able to see the patterns, and within that, find your story. And that's probably the act of self-empathy.
Thank you for sharing that, Dash. I think the time is limited always, unfortunately. But these are the things that I'm taking away. One, empathy is much deeper than the words can define right now. And unfortunately, it seems that our frameworks limit us from going to the depths of it, truly. Second, the opposite of empathy is judgment. And empathy demands us to relinquish judgment. Third, that to truly know someone, we must first know ourselves. And for that, we must observe and we must empathize with our own selves first. That's what I'm taking away. Thank you so much for your time today, Dash. This has been eye-opening. If I were to ask you one last question, what is your hope for the world with empathy today?
There was a word called love, which was beautiful. And now it's just the email sign off. Love dash, love this, love that. We have actually sort of murdered a beautiful, beautiful word, which was born. I mean, do you know what love means? It's a powerful word. And yet today we sort of use it without being conscious of what it is. And we don't even practice love. I mean, we use it. So see the difference between the understanding of the word and practice. So my hope for empathy is that we do not make it another word like love. And one is we truly, truly understand it. And the highest wish is that we practice empathy in every action. It's like, that's my wish, is that I wish we practice empathy and honor it. It's a beautiful word.
All right. Thank you so much for your time today, Dash.